Hello and welcome. You are listening to the Just Love Them podcast, a place where we seek to find understanding and peace with those we love who have left their faith. Ultimately, our goal is to heal our relationships. Thank you so much for rating and reviewing my podcast. I so appreciate that you do that for me. I want to share a testimonial by Tammy B. She says, "Your podcasts are so uplifting and helpful to me. I really enjoy them a lot, and I'm strengthened and encouraged and in better spirits. And I've learned so much. Thank you." Thanks for taking time to write that, Tammy. It means a lot. I am always looking for someone to interview who has left their faith and then come back. It was so interesting because recently, as I was actually chatting with friends over Marco Polo, a series of conversations happened that led me to realize that I have a story like that of someone who left and then came back in my own family that I hadn't even thought of before. I was so surprised when I realized this. This person in my family is not alive anymore. And since he's not here to tell his story, I'm going to tell it on his behalf. It is what he would want. This is the story of my third great grandfather, Martin Harris. Now, if you're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you very likely know who Martin Harris is. If you are not a member of that church, this is a story about a man who was converted to the church and then left and then came back. And whatever faith you belong to, you may know stories or have seen people or even have your own ancestors who were faithful and then left and came back. So this story is very specific to this church. But as we all know, there are people of all denominations who sometimes lose their faith and then eventually come back, which gives me hope. This is an extreme story. This man had some extreme experiences, and that makes his story all the more interesting. If he were here, he would tell you that he was born into an affluent family in Easton, New York in the year 1783. He was known for honesty, an excellent memory, shrewdness in business, a strong work ethic, civil spirit, financial generosity, and neighborliness. He would tell you that he was 5'8" with a light complexion, blue eyes, brown hair, and he wore a Greek-style beard. He married his first cousin, Lucy, and together they had 4 children. Lucy characterized him as industrious, attentive to domestic concerns, an excellent provider and father. Martin was a well-respected and prosperous landowner in Palmyra, New York. He favored doing business in gold and silver, and he rejected the use of paper money. At one point, he owned 320 acres. Martin Harris was an unchurched Christian, meaning he chose to follow God and not man in matters of religion. This may have been because at one point he was attending 5 different churches at the same time. And then in the year 1818, he had a dream. And in this dream, he was inspired of the Lord and taught that he should not join any church, that the true biblical church was not on the earth. In his own words that he wrote much later as an old man, he said, quote, that the Lord showed me there was no true church upon the face of the earth, none built upon the foundation, designated by the Savior, the rock of revelation, as declared to Peter. He also showed me that an angel should come and restore the holy priesthood again on the earth, and commission his servants again with the holy gospel to preach to them that dwell on the earth. He further showed me that the time was near when he would set his hand again the second time to restore the kingdom of Israel, when he would gather the outcasts of Israel and the dispersed of Judah from the 4 quarters of the earth, when he would bring the record of Judah, when the 2 records should become one in the hand of the Lord to accomplish this great work in the last days. Unquote. Very interesting that he had a dream that told him that the true biblical church was not on the earth. And after that, he quit going to those 5 different churches and he became what he called an unchurched Christian. He was very interested in religion, however. As he became more affluent, Martin had a spacious 1.5-story frame home built for his family's comfort. Martin wanted his home to be a showplace with every detail of construction well attended. The home was nearly finished in 1824. Only a few details remained. Rocking up a well on the east side of the kitchen entrance and walling up a basement. To finish these minor tasks, Martin hired Joseph Smith Sr. and his son, Hiram. What was unusual about the working conditions of the Smiths was that every day while they were there, Martin would find some excuse to bring up the matter of young Joseph Smith and the rumors surrounding his vision of an angel and gold plates. Martin asked many questions and referred frequently to the Bible to prove that heavenly messengers visiting the earth was not that unusual and not new doctrine. Joseph Smith Sr. believed that Martin's questions were sincere, and he told Martin of his confidence that his son Joseph had seen an angel and gold plates. Well, Martin took it to the Lord. He prayed about what the Smiths family was telling him, and he got an answer. He was then satisfied that it was the Lord's work, and he was under covenant himself to help bring it forth. Outside the Smiths' immediate family, Martin was the first person to embrace the account of the angel Moroni's visit to Joseph Smith. He gave Joseph Smith $50, enabling Joseph and his wife Emma to move to Harmony, Pennsylvania, to get away from people who were persecuting him and the thieves who were trying to steal the plates. Emma's parents lived in Harmony, and Joseph was able to continue translating the plates while he was there. Martin also went to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and from April to June of 1828, Martin acted as the scribe for Joseph as he translated the plates. This involvement damaged his reputation. His neighbors began to think he was crazy. He lost credibility in the community. His wife was not happy and not enthused with his new interest. His wife, Lucy, was very persistent. She insisted that if there were gold plates, she wanted to see them. She wanted proof. She was worried about financial ruin and she was worried about their reputation. So she went to Harmony to see the plates. Apparently, she ransacked the house, looked in every nook and cranny and cupboard, couldn't find them, and then went to the woods to find them. There is a story that a black snake stopped her in her tracks. She never did see the plates, but according to Lucy Mack Smith, Lucy Harris saw the angel and the gold plates in a night dream. After that, Martin took Lucy back home and then continued their translation. After the first 116 pages were translated, Martin began to plead with Joseph to let him show the Book of Mormon manuscript to his wife and a few relatives. Joseph finally agreed. As you likely know, the results were disastrous. In the book Undeniable by Susan Easton Black, she tells the story of how Martin promised that he would not show the manuscript to any except for 5 individuals who belonged to his household: his wife, his mother and father, his brother, and his sister-in-law. Quote, Martin had the manuscript in his possession for 3 weeks or until about 7 July 1828. It's assumed that he kept the covenant at first and showed the manuscript only to the named family members. That changed, however, when a very particular friend made him a visit, of whom he related all he knew concerning the record. The man's curiosity was much excited, and he earnestly desired to see the manuscript. Martin was anxious to gratify his friend, although it was contrary to his obligation. When he went to seek for the manuscript, he found that the key could not be found. He resolved to carry his design into execution, and to do this, he picked the lock of the bureau. By doing so, Martin marred Lucy's bureau. As the days passed, he did not fix it. More importantly, he blatantly refused to adhere to his covenant. Martin showed the manuscript to others, or as Joseph Smith wrote, notwithstanding the great restrictions which he had been laid under, and the solemnity of the covenant which he had made with me, he did show them to others. Unquote. Well, the manuscript went missing. No one knows for sure what happened to it, but it was gone. This caused a lot of consternation for Joseph Smith and for Martin. Dallin H. Oaks has said, quote, he is often associated with the loss of the 116 manuscript pages of the Book of Mormon. He overcame that fault, however, and became a key figure in the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, one of the monumental events of the Restoration. Martin's subsequent faithfulness after losing the manuscript continues under a shadow from which this important man should be rescued. Unquote. After the loss of the 116 pages, and due to his wife Lucy's failing health and their strained relationship, Martin went back to Palmyra to care for her and their family business. He was never again able to assist a scribe for the actual translation. In spite of this humbling experience, penitent Martin did not lose his faith. If he were here, he would tell you that in the spring of 1829, he returned to Harmony, sincerely desiring to have another witness about the plates. A revelation sought on Martin's request promised that, quote, 3 of my servants shall know of a surety that Joseph's claims about the plates are true, for from heaven will I declare it on them, unquote. In Doctrine and Covenants 5, verses 11 through 13, Martin was promised that he could be one of the 3 to witness the plates if he humbled himself before the Lord. He was very excited about this. Joseph and Martin then walked to a nearby grove with Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer, who were chosen to be the other 2 witnesses, where they called upon the Lord. When the promised divine manifestation did not happen, Martin suggested that he thought he was the cause. He withdrew and went away from the others. After that, the angel Moroni appeared and showed the plates to Joseph and Oliver and David. After this wonderful experience, Joseph went in search of Martin, who was quite a ways off in the woods, and he finally found him engaged in humble prayer. Then the 2 of them were blessed with the vision, similar to the one that had taken place with the other witnesses. When the 4 men returned to the Whitmer cabin, Martin seemed almost overcome with joy and testified boldly to what he had heard and seen. You can read about the testimony of these 3 witnesses in the beginning of the Book of Mormon. Well, then it came time to print the book. And for the printing of the Book of Mormon, Martin felt prompted to pay for the printing of 5,000 copies, which was going to cost $3,000, which was a huge sum, approximately $75,000 in today's economy. It was simply impossible for the Smith family to raise even a small fraction of that amount. But Martin proved his devotion by pledging his valuable farm to cover the tremendous expense. In August of 1829, he mortgaged his home and his farm to Egbert B. Grandin to secure payment on a printer's contract. This actually placed him side by side with Joseph Smith in a negotiating role that proved vital to the Restoration. Dallin H. Oaks has said that one of Martin Harris's greatest contributions to the church, for which he should be honored for all time, was his financing the publication of the Book of Mormon. As a side note, later, when the mortgage note fell due, he ended up having to sell his home and a portion of the farm to pay the $3,000. Martin had some amazing things happen to him. Besides getting to see an angel and the plates and all that went with that experience, he had other amazing experiences. He was present when the church was organized on April 6, 1830. He was baptized that same day by Oliver Cowdery. When Joseph Smith urged the saints to move from New York to Kirtland, Ohio, Martin helped by being responsible for the safety of helping 50 people move there. At the very first conference that the church held in Kirtland in 1830, Martin was ordained a priest. Now, when the saints moved to Kirtland, his wife and his children, of which he had 4, remained in Palmyra. 2 households were established so that Martin Harris could make periodic trips between the 2 locations. He spent weeks traveling in Independence, Missouri with Joseph Smith and back, and he heard the prophet prophesy about what would eventually be built there. He had the great privilege of receiving his patriarchal blessing from Joseph Smith Sr. He was ordained a high priest on June 6, 1831. He was one of the early missionaries of the 1830s. In 1832, Martin and his brother Emer baptized 100 people in Pennsylvania. It's rumored that he spent much of 1833 in jail for preaching. He served on the First High Council. He was a wagoner on the Zion's Camp excursion, reportedly taking one of his sons with him, and again traveling and interacting daily with Joseph Smith. He also had the very special experience of helping choose the very first 12 apostles in this dispensation in February of 1835, along with David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery. They, the 3 of them, and the first presidency united in prayer and received counsel. The presidency then laid their hands on the heads of those 3 witnesses and set them apart to select and ordain 12 men to be the apostles of the Lord Jesus Christ. In 1836, he was present at the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, and he was blessed to receive his initiatory ordinances in the Kirtland Temple. He did some amazing things. He got to be part of some amazing experiences. He also had hard things happen. Later that same summer, after a long illness, his wife, estranged wife, Lucy Harris, died. On November 1st of that same year, Martin married Caroline Young, who was the niece of Brigham Young. Martin served faithfully for the next few years. And if he were here, I would say, how could anything have taken you from your activity in the church, the experiences you've had, and all the amazing things you've witnessed, and all the amazing things you've done and been part of? How could you have left the faith? And if Martin were here, I think he would tell me that we have a bird's eye view. We are standing back in the future, seeing everything, knowing what the future will hold, knowing how it will all unfold. But he wasn't. He was in the middle of it. And sometimes when you're in the middle of it, it's hard to stand back and see clearly. And so as the Kirtland Safety Society bank that Joseph Smith had set up failed, and as some other hard things happened, Martin lost faith in Joseph Smith, in his prophetic calling, and he began to believe that Joseph was a fallen prophet. And I can see that from our bird's eye view, how we can't imagine how anyone could have thought that. And I can imagine from my bird's eye view how we can absolutely see that Joseph Smith was a prophet. We've seen everything that's happened since then. But I can also see that from Martin's perspective, being right in the middle of it, I can see how Satan would have worked very, very hard on him, and how doubts could have crept in, and how he could have started gathering evidence that maybe Joseph was a fallen prophet. Martin later said that he had lost confidence in Joseph Smith, and he later admitted that his mind became darkened and he was left to himself. As he became antagonistic, he was removed from the High Council on September 3rd, 1837, and then excommunicated in December of that same year. He again did humble himself at one point and was rebaptized in 1842. So he rallied back up. But when the saints left, moved to Nauvoo, he stayed in Kirtland. By 1844, he was still on the rolls of the church, but he was not active and had started pursuing other religious interests. He remained outside church fellowship for the next 28 years. And during that time, he aligned himself with various religious persuasions and went from this thing to that thing. His wife, Caroline, his second wife, was always a faithful member of the church, and she longed to be near her own family and close friends. As the saints moved from Nauvoo to the Rocky Mountains, Caroline had a great desire to go with them. She was always a faithful member of the church, and she longed to be near her family and her close friends. She consistently urged her husband to go with the saints to the Rocky Mountains. He thought about going to Salt Lake multiple times, apparently, and he even told people he was going to sell his farm and go, but he didn't. In 1856, his wife Caroline finally grew tired of his broken promises, and she left with their 4 children, ages 1 to 18, and being pregnant, and left for the Rocky Mountains. That fifth baby was born on the plains in Iowa, and it took Caroline eventually 3 years to get from Kirtland to Salt Lake City. Well, after Caroline left, Martin acted as the self-appointed caretaker and guide of the Kirtland Temple. He bore witness of the Book of Mormon, something he never denied. Even though he denied Joseph Smith and a lot of other things, he never denied the Book of Mormon. In the 1860 census, he even listed himself as a Mormon preacher. Of his 4 children born from Lucy, all of his children died fairly young, his last son being killed in the Civil War in 1864. 14 years after Caroline had left him, somewhere between October and December of 1869, William Homer and his cousin came to visit Martin Harris on their way back from a mission. Now, William Homer was the brother-in-law of Martin Harris Jr., his sister being married to Martin Harris Jr. So he thought that Martin would be excited to see him and hear about his family. As soon as he identified who he was as a Mormon, as a missionary, Martin Harris apparently became quite excited against the church and asked Brother Homer if he was one of those Brighamites. He seemed not to understand that there stood before him a man who knew his wife and his children. Now, there was obviously no cell phones. There actually had apparently been no letter writing back and forth in all this time either. And he had no idea how his wife and children were faring. But his very first response to seeing this man was to be upset about the church. After calming down, he showed Brother Homer and his cousin, who was with him, the temple. Finally, after showing them the temple, he said, "So, you know my family then?" "Yes," Homer replied, asking, "Wouldn't you like to see your family again?" Martin confessed that he would like to see Caroline and the children, but he was now impoverished and living with relatives. He had no money, and we don't know what happened with that. Brother Homer insisted that that didn't need to stand in the way, that President Young would be only too glad to furnish means to convey him to Utah. Apparently, the mere mention of Brigham Young angered Martin. He said, "Don't talk of Brigham Young." Homer tried to ignore his anger and suggested that Martin send a message to President Young. Martin finally said, "You call on Brigham Young. Tell him of our visit. Tell him that Martin Harris is an old man living on charity with his relatives. Tell him I should like to visit my family in Utah. My children, I would be happy to accept help from the church, but I want no personal favor. Wait, tell him that if he sends money, he must send enough for a round trip. I should not want to remain in Utah." President Young was told about the conversation. He said, "Yes, send for him, even if it were to take the last dollar of my own." Martin Harris spent his time and his money freely when $1 was worth more than $1,000 are worth now. "Send for him? Yes, indeed, I shall send. Rest assured, Martin Harris will be here in time." 2 months after Brother Homer had visited, Edward Stevenson, who was a member of the 70 who'd been on a short mission back east, visited Kirtland and also met Martin Harris. These men eventually started sharing letters back and forth, and Martin expressed a desire to migrate west. I can see the Spirit working on Martin, softening him as he's approached repeatedly. Stevenson shared one of Martin's letters with Brigham Young. He suggested that Stevenson set up a subscription fund to raise money to assist Martin on his journey to the Salt Lake Valley. Brother Stevenson liked this suggestion and went to work. President Young was among the first to contribute, giving $25 to the subscription fund. Others contributed more or less, and soon about $200 was raised. Brother Stevenson took a train, went to Kirtland, arrived there on August 7th, 1870, where he found the 88-year-old Martin Harris anxiously awaiting him. Can you see how the Spirit worked on Martin? He was so bitter at one point. Are you one of those Brighamites? He had said. And yet, over a little period of time, the Spirit had worked on him to the point that he was excited about his prospective journey and wanted to come to Utah. Was his main goal he wanted to see his wife and children? Of course it was. But before he hadn't been willing to go, or he would have gone. And now he was. We never know what's going on in someone else's mind and heart. Well, back to the story. Along the way to Utah, there were stops. Martin was delighted to find crowds that wanted to hear his story, and he related his story of being part of bringing forth the Book of Mormon. For example, on August 21st, 1870, Elder Stevenson recorded that, quote, Martin Harris was with me in Chicago and at the American Hotel told a large number of people of the visitation of the angel, unquote. Martin had always enjoyed the ability to meet people and make friends and was fearless in telling what he knew about Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. They also had a stopover in Des Moines, Iowa, and talked to the Latter-day Saints there. Martin Harris told them about the Book of Mormon, bearing testimony, and they took up a collection and bought him a suit of clothes, which made Martin feel like a new man. Well, he finally arrived in Utah 14 years after his wife had left him in Kirtland. He arrived in Salt Lake City on August 30th, 1870 at 7:30 p.m. Despite his 88 years, he was remarkably vigorous, his memory and sight being very good. Martin's grandniece, Arinda Crandall McEwen, offered to house Martin in Salt Lake City until his family from Smithfield could take him home. He stayed in Salt Lake City for about 6 weeks. I imagine the Spirit continuing to work on him and testify to him during this time. While he was in Salt Lake City, hundreds of people came to see him, including Brigham Young and reportedly his estranged wife, Caroline. 2 weeks later, on September 17th, 1870, 5 apostles gathered near the baptismal font in the endowment house to witness the rebaptism of Martin Harris. Imagine, he's been out of the church since sometime before 1844, and it's now 1870, close to 30 years. His story gives me hope. He was baptized by Edward Stevenson, the man who'd gone to Kirtland to get him. Orson Pratt confirmed him a member of the church, and he received his endowments in the endowment house on October 21st, 1870, at 88 years old. He had the privilege of speaking twice in the tabernacle, including with Elder Stevenson and George Albert Smith, and he bore powerful testimony of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon. We don't have his official message, but one person recorded that he proclaimed, quote, I did go to the woods with Joseph Smith and beheld an angel sent from heaven and a dazzling light of glory. I saw the gold plates. I saw him turn the leaves over one by one. And I was commanded by God's voice to testify to all the world what I have seen and heard, unquote. Another person reported Martin saying, quote, it is not a matter of belief, but it is a matter of knowledge. I saw the plates and the inscription thereon. I saw the angel, and he showed them unto me, unquote. Charles W. Nibley, who later became the church's presiding bishop, recorded hearing Martin Harris preach, and he said that he spoke with a fiery, animated tone to his voice and a bright, keen expression in his eyes, but with a deep humility when he repeated his unwavering testimony. If Martin were here, he would tell you that he knew his time was precious. He's 88 years old. He spent his days renewing his family relationships, which is what he longed for, and not the fanfare that was in the city. And so he moved to Smithfield after 6 weeks to live with his oldest son, Martin Harris Jr., who is my great-great-grandfather. He lived in rural Smithfield for the next 4 years, often testifying of seeing an angel in gold plates. He shared his testimony wherever he could. You see, he's come back. In 1874, when he was too feeble to walk to town, those wanting to hear his testimony came to his residence. In October of 1874, his son Martin Harris Jr. and their family moved to Clarkston, just a few miles away from Smithfield, where they were going to be caretakers of a home and property for the next year. His son Martin Harris Jr. knew he needed to hire someone to help him move and to help with the responsibilities in their new location. This next part I'm going to quote from a document called Martin Harris of Clarkston, Utah. It's a biography. Quote, Martin Jr. went to the place of the newly arrived immigrant family. Following introductions, he learned the new family's name was Pilkington and that they came from England. He explained his planned relocation to nearby Clarkston and then stated the purpose of his night call. He wanted to hire one of the family's 2 teenage sons to live with him for 1 year. Then, pointing to the younger boy, he asked if he would go and live with and work with him for a year. The boy's father inquired as to what the boy would get for this service and was told that the boy would get a 2-year-old heifer plus his board and clothing. The terms were agreeable, and the young fellow, William Pilkington, a couple of months from his 14th birthday, put on his coat and hat and kissed his family goodbye and went with Martin Jr. to his log house a 10-minute walk away. Boy, have times changed. At the Harris's home, most of the rest of the family had retired to bed, and young Pilkington was given some bread and milk to eat and shown where he could sleep on the floor. After his new employer went to bed, Pilkington finished eating and in the dim light of an oil lamp noticed an object in the corner of the room. As he went to bed down, he discovered the object was an old man sitting in the chair, who motioned for the young man to pull up his chair beside him. The elderly man asked a series of questions, learning the boy's mother called him Willie, and that his family had just arrived from England and that they were members of the church. Willie told the old man that he was going to live and work for the Harris family for a year. Then the old man concluded, saying, Willie, tomorrow night after your chores are done and we have had supper and all the folks have gone to bed, I want you to sit down in this chair close to mine, for I have lots to tell you. Willie said he would do it, and then both retired to bed on the floor. Unquote. And so, young William Pilkington, 14 years old, had many conversations with Martin Harris, and he heard his story retold many times as he helped take care of him. William Pilkington later wrote, From that time on and to his death, he never tired of telling me of the beauties of the gospel, and especially about the early rise of the church and the trials and tribulations that beset the prophet Joseph Smith and himself. He told me many, many times that he did stand in the presence of the angel of the Lord with Joseph Smith and heard the voice of God from heaven declare that everything the angel told them was true, and that the Book of Mormon was translated correctly. He said he was commanded by the voice of God to testify to all the world what he had seen and heard was correct. And then in his talks with me, he would say, he had asked me many times if I would tell the people what he had told me. And he repeated now, Willie, you won't forget to tell the people what I've told you after I am dead and gone, will you? And he would hold up his hand to the square and say that he was telling the truth. And I would tell him, no, Grandpa, I won't. Willie had come to call him Grandpa. I will sure tell the people what you have told me, but I know that you have told the truth, unquote. Many people came to visit Martin in Clarkston, and he looked forward to these visits, for he wanted to share his testimony. At this point, he asked his listeners to promise him that they would tell other people his testimony, and he believed that death would soon take him. In July of 1875, Martin suffered what is thought to be a stroke. Tasks performed easily just days before were now impossible. Caring for him proved difficult, and nearby neighbors were asked to help. His last testimony was recorded by both William Pilkington and William Homer. William Pilkington stayed by his side and recorded his last testimony. He said, quote, I wanted to get what I thought would be his last words, but he could not talk. I could not understand what he wanted to tell me. He tried hard to tell me. So I stroked his hair back on his forehead and I knelt down and prayed to the Lord and asked him in the name of Jesus to strengthen his servant's voice. Pilkington wrote of being inspired to ask Martin if he wanted to hold up his right hand so he could bear testimony. He heard a clear yes. As William Pilkington held up Martin's right hand, Martin was able to speak, and he told him of seeing an angel descend from heaven in a dazzling glory of light and stood about 2 feet off the ground. I saw the plates. I saw him turn the leaves over one by one. I saw the Urim and Thummim, the breastplate, and the sword of Laban. Martin concluded with, "My eyes have beheld the glory of God. Hosanna to God and the Lamb." Unquote. William Homer, who was also there, wrote this about the experience. The next day, July 10th, 1875, marked the end. It was in the evening, milking time, and Martin's son and his wife had gone out to do the evening chores. Martin had woken up and asked for a drink of water. I put my arm under the old gentleman, raised him up, and held the glass to his lips. He drank freely. Then he looked up at me and recognized me. He said, "I know you. You're my friend." Yes, I did see the plates on which the Book of Mormon was written. I did see the angel. I did hear the voice of God. I know that Joseph Smith is a prophet of God, holding the keys of the holy priesthood. Whereupon Martin Harris rested back on his bed and died as the sun sank beneath the Clarkston Hills to the west. Unquote. I find it so hopeful that when Martin Harris came back to the gospel, he came back with full force. It's interesting that all three witnesses who saw the angel on the plates left the church within 8 years of having that experience. Oliver Cowdery died while he was still a young man. David Whitmer never returned, even though he lived to be an older gentleman. Of the 12 men who saw the gold plates, the 3 witnesses, and then the 8 witnesses, what we didn't talk about today, but their testimonies in the front of the Book of Mormon. And then Joseph Smith himself makes 12, the 3 plus the 8 plus Joseph. 12 men saw the gold plates. Martin Harris is the only one of those 12 men who ever came to Utah, who ever came back to the gospel, because all of those men, except Joseph Smith, left the faith that they had come to know, that they had a testimony of. They all left. And when Martin Harris finally did come back, he was 88 years old. This July 10th marks the 150th anniversary of the death of this great man. I thought about holding this podcast episode off until July because it would be perfect timing to have this one air. But I just couldn't do it. This is the right time. And the testimony to me and to all of us is that it's never too late. Our loved ones may have had a very strong testimony at some point. They may have had great experiences and then have fallen away. But whether in this life or in the next, it's never too late. I testify that that gives you as great of a hope as it gives me. Please join me again next time for another episode of Just Love Them.